Hey, this is Derek. In this video, we're going to talk about enemy defense, specifically how much damage they take in their normal and devil trigger forms. While preparing to make this video, I tested a lot of different moves against the various enemies in the game to see if certain enemies took more or less damage compared to others, and I discovered some really cool, interesting stuff which I wanted to share with you, and will no doubt come in handy on some of the game's harder difficulties. Just like in my previous video, I used a spreadsheet to track everything, which for those who are interested, I've uploaded to Google Drive, and there's a link in the description below. It is a living spreadsheet that I'm going to be updating as time goes on, as I'm testing out various things across the game, so feel free to bookmark it and circle back occasionally to see if there's any updates. And just as before, the Void is set to Dante Must Die difficulty, so keep that in mind because enemies do take more damage on some of the easier difficulties. Yep, I tested that too. And in case you're curious, I actually haven't had the chance to test Hell and Hell mode because unfortunately I haven't unlocked it yet. Let's kick things off with Mission 1, Establishing a Baseline. I know, this is super boring, but it's also really important to cover because I'm going to be referring back to these damage values throughout the rest of the video. I started with recording the damage for the first hit of Nero's combo A, which is 40 damage, the first hit of Nero's aerial combo, which is 50 damage, and finally Nero's Buster, which does different amounts of damage depending on the enemy. But the more moves you test, the better. And I did this against every enemy in the game, against their normal mode and their DT mode. Yeah, it took a while, but it was so worth it because of what I found. So let's dive into Mission 2, the good shit. Starting off with enemy defense, the first thing I found is that the majority of enemies in the game take the same amount of damage. Going back to the damage values I showed you in Mission 1, they will take 40 damage from the first hit of Nero's combo A and 50 damage from the first hit of Aerial Wave. In fact, it was actually surprising how many enemies take the same amount of damage. To demonstrate, here's a quick list. Now what's even more interesting is that the enemies that are not on this list will actually take even more damage or less damage depending on the enemy, which I'll cover in more detail further on in the video. Next up is Devil Trigger Defense. So this is the second major thing that I found, and that it's every enemy in the game gets a 50% damage reduction or a 50% increase in defense, whichever you prefer, when they Devil Trigger. So going back to our good friend the Empusa here, we notice that our 40 damage from the first hit of Nero's combo A has now been reduced to 20, and the damage from Nero's aerial rave has actually dropped from 50 to 25. Even Buster receives the same 50% damage reduction as well, and I tested other moves as well and I noticed the same 50% reduction, so thankfully it's actually stable across the board. Now I repeated this process against every enemy in the game, and I'd love to show you that in action as proof, but for the sake of time and fear of absolutely boring you to death, I'm not going to. But everything's in the spreadsheet, and you can also test it for yourself. Next up, let's talk about some of the enemies that take more or less damage, the exceptions. First up, we're going to take a look at the Scudo Angelo. Now normally, there's nothing special about these guys. They take the same damage as the majority of the enemies, the same 40 and 50 base damage from Nero's combo A and the aerial rave respectively. But interestingly enough, if you manage to break their shields, they will take even more damage. You can see here that he's actually taking 30 damage instead of the standard 20, which is what he'll actually take if he DTs and still has the shield. So when you break the shield, you're actually getting a 50% damage boost. Now normally on Dante Must Die, they automatically Devil Trigger as soon as their shield is broken, so you're still going to be doing less damage compared to their base form, but if they're already DT'd and they still have the shield, break that shit and they'll die faster. So keep that in mind next time you find these guys blocking your path. Next up is the Pyrobat, and the Lusatia. Now I group these guys together because it's really straightforward. They're super squishy and take 50% more damage in both their normal forms and their DT'd forms. So as an example, the first hit of your combo A is going to do 60 damage instead of the regular 40, and etc, etc. Now next up is the Fury. Now I'm sure most of you have already realized that these guys are already super squishy and they do take tons of damage, thankfully, to offset their annoying offense and attack patterns. And this is why. They actually take double damage. Your normal slash will do 80 instead of 40 damage. And of course this extends to his DT form as well. Now moving on, we have the Hellbat. Okay, these guys are interesting. Basically, the Hellbat has two forms. His ignited form and what I call his dark form, where his frames are actually doused. So when ignited, he actually takes 80% less damage. 80%! You're only doing 8 damage with your basic slashes. What the f***? You can get around this in two ways. Number one is knock his ass down and he'll take normal damage. Or certain moves will actually expel his flames and he'll enter his dark mode, and if you manage to pin him down in this mode and attack him, he'll take normal damage as well. Okay, next up is the Nobody. Now this guy is a bit of an oddball because he has several different forms and each one will actually take different amounts of damage. Now the way to tell which form he's in is by what type of mask he's wearing. As you're fighting it, you'll actually see the arm on its back reach out and attach different types of masks to its face, while the old one it was wearing gets discarded on the ground. In his first form, he's wearing the golden mask, and we can see here that he gets a 20% defense boost or only takes 80% of regular damage. His second form is the blue mask. This is the one where he's chucking those explosive eyeballs at you. In this form, he still has a defense boost, but it's only 10%, so he'll take 90% regular damage. The third form is this tribal mask here, where the arm on his back becomes huge and he becomes much more aggressive. In this form, he has no additional defense. Finally, if he is cycled from the gold mask to the tribal mask to the blue mask, it's actually possible to knock off the blue mask and leave him completely maskless. And in this form, he no longer attacks you. All he can do is cower and back away. And also, he'll take triple damage. Yes, you heard that right. 300% damage if you manage to knock off all his masks. But interestingly enough, if he cycles from the gold mask to the blue mask to the tribal mask, it doesn't appear possible to knock off the tribal mask, so he'll stay in this form until he dies. In other words, in order to get to the maskless form, he needs to cycle from the gold to the tribal to the blue. And in case you're wondering, the order of masks does appear to be random. He seems to always start with the gold mask, at least here in the Void, and whether he switches to the blue or tribal one is anyone's guess. Finally, there doesn't appear to be anything specific or special to knocking his mask off. It seems the more you attack its face, the more likely you are to knock it off. Needless to say, there's a lot more to these enemies than I initially thought, so I'll have to dive into more detail in an enemy-specific guide that I'll be uploading in the future. For now, let's move on to the Proto Angelo. This guy is really interesting. For the most part, he's the same as everybody. He'll take the same damage and he'll get a 50% damage reduction when he devil triggers. But when his health drops below 25%, he has what I call a last stand mechanic. Basically, he gets another 50% damage boost, bringing his total devil trigger defense to 75%, which gives him the highest defense in the game. Now, I also tested this on other difficulties, and sure enough, as soon as his health drops below 25%, he gets that same defense increase or damage reduction, however you want to phrase it. And also, regarding this last stand mechanic, as far as I can tell, it is unique to the Proto Angelo. I tested a bunch of different enemies and saw how they reacted when they get less than 25%. And unless I'm wrong, which I very well could be, it seems that it's unique to the Proto Angelo alone. Very, very, very interesting. Now, both the Empusa Queen and the Behemoth have some stuff too, but I'm going to be talking about them more in the next section, so let's move on to the real juicy shit. Mission 3. Enemies have weak points. Yes! I could hardly believe this myself, and I stumbled onto it by accident. But some enemies actually have certain spots where they will take increased damage or even decreased damage depending on the enemy and where you're attacking them. And nothing illustrates this point better than our good friend Chaos right here. Hitting his front side does 40 damage just like normal, but if you'll notice, if you attack from the other side at his back, on his tail, and where his spines and armor is evidently the thickest, you'll notice there's a drastic drop in the damage output. But funny enough, if you break their spines, they lose that additional layer of defense and will take damage as normal. Now, aside from the Chaos, the only other enemies in the game with weak points that I've seen so far are the super heavy class, namely the Empusa Queen and the Behemoth. So let's take a look at those next. The first thing you need to know is that she will take 10% less damage to attacks against her body. So her body has a little bit more defense. But if you manage to get in the air and attack her head, or if you attack her tail, your attacks will actually do 10% more damage. Now, as for the Behemoth, in its first form, you can see that its body is actually encased in armor, and sure enough, he will actually take 70% less damage if you hit him in these armored areas. So basically, the majority of his body, which is covered in this form. But if you manage to get around to the other side, his tail, which you can actually see has no armor, you will do full damage. Your attacks will do 100% of their normal baseline damage. Now in the slug form, however, attacks to his body will deal more damage than normal. You'll see about a 10% damage boost to the body. But if you attack the tentacles coming out of his face, you will actually deal 50% more damage. So again, aim for those tentacles, baby, and wreck his face. Alright, and aside from those, I didn't find any other weak points. I did check out the rest of the cast, but I could be wrong, and if you do find anything, please let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear from you, and I'd love to be proven wrong. Alright squad, that's it for another video. I hope you enjoyed and learned something new. Make sure you subscribe and follow me on Twitter and all that jazz, because there is more DMC5 content in the works and I'd hate for you to miss it. As always, thank you very much for watching. My name's Derek, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.